Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, Philip, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Luke. It's good to be back.
Hey, well, it's always a privilege to have you and always great to learn from you. And actually, apart from a gentleman named Tyler Staten in the Western USA who jumped on the podcast, our last conversation with you from 2021 is our most downloaded and engaged with episode.
All right.
Yeah. So countless listeners really, really appreciate you. So grateful to you for carving out time today. And there's a lot we want to cover together, but I want to start on a more personal note, Philip, and maybe a more pastoral note. Recently, I was reading an article you wrote in your blog. I believe it was called A Cry of Grief.
Right.
And you said, no one escapes this life unmarked by suffering. We broken people live on a broken planet, and grief is part of the price we pay. And I'm very sorry for this loss, Philip. And I know you were writing reflections on your own mother's life and her passing, some of the grief that she navigated, especially as for much of her life as a single mom, having lost her husband several years ago. And so I just appreciate, Philip, for you that you're in a tender season, that you've navigated the loss of a close family member. And yeah, I can only imagine what each day in that process holds for you. And so I wanted to just ask, how are you in that? And in the midst of that, are there ways in which you've experienced God's love for you, his presence to you, and his peace to you in a time of such unique grief?
Yes, as it happens, I live in Colorado, western part of the United States, and I grew up in the state of Georgia, southeast, so a long way away, and that's where my mother was living. Those who have read my memoir, Where the Light Fell, know that my life started with grief in a lot of ways, a grief that I didn't realize because I was only a year old, 13 months old, when my father died. So I had no conscious memories of him. It was part of a different pandemic back then, the polio pandemic, which mostly affected children. But in my father's case, he was 23, somehow contracted the disease and was completely paralyzed, lived in an iron lung for a couple of months. And then finally, a group of Christians believed he would be healed. So they removed him from the iron lung. And my mother was part of that group. She believed he would be healed, and he wasn't healed. He died. And we lived under that shadow, kind of a theological shadow. These were people who loved him, who cared for him. They were going to be missionaries. And it seemed like, why would God, quote, take somebody with that potential at that age? But that really set the course of our little family. So it was my mother, now a widow, very ill-equipped to deal with reality. She'd never written a check. She had never driven a car. And here she is left with these two boys in a different part of the country she grew up in. And just kind of an alien environment, a very fearful time, I'm sure. And that worked out in not very healthy ways in my family that people can read in the memoir, Where the Light Fell. But back to the recent passing of my mother, I'm a member of a book group, and we have a different book each month to discuss together by Zoom. And the book for that month in May was Lament for a Son by Nicholas Wolterstorff. Wolterstorff is a very fine Christian philosopher, kind of started the renewal movement of Christian philosophy. Wow. And really established it again as a respectable occupation and worldview, even in circles of atheist philosophers. They respected Wolterstorff and people like that. And he lost a son. I think he was in his early 20s as well. while mountain climbing. An architect, young architect with a lot of potential. He was in Austria and fell in kind of a freak accident and died. And so here we were. I went as my mother was in hospice, looked like she didn't have a long time to live. And I went to be with her in what may be her last week. She was 1 week shy of 99 years old.
Wow.
And so in the morning, I would get up, make a cup of coffee, and read Walter Storff's book, Lament for a Son, about losing his 20-something-year-old son. And then go upstairs where my mother is clinging to life. Sometimes she would be conscious and we could have a conversation, sometimes not. And just that juxtaposition, there's a huge difference between losing a 20-something-year-old son and losing a woman who lived a long and rich life. My mother hung on until she reached that 99th birthday.
Wow.
And then the following week she died, and we were with her. My wife and I were with her when she died. So you're right, a lot of memories come up. There was a lot of dysfunction in my family. My mother and brother had no contact at all, either visual or even audio, for 50 years. And then in the last couple of years, I've gotten them together on phone conversations about 3 or 4 times. And then shortly before she died, my brother, on his own, wrote a 3-word card. He said, "I forgive you."
Wow.
And that was it. Nothing more. But it kind of freed her, I think, to let go, because she was hanging on with that unresolved relationship. And all that was happening at once. It's one of those moments where things are converging. But we were very glad to be with her that final week. I wouldn't miss that for anything. And we had some sweet moments, as well as some moments of just waiting by her bedside, listening to her breathe more and more urgently until finally breath stopped.
It feels like a very sacred time. And go ahead.
It really is. My wife was a hospice chaplain. And when she first proposed that, I thought, Janet, you really want to hang around people who are dying all day? And she would come home and say, that's the most sacred time, because the families often come together with all their unresolved issues, and you're ministering as much to the families as to the patient. And she kept saying, hearing is the last sense to go. We know that in hospice. So keep talking.
Yeah.
And in my mother's case, keep singing. She loved the old hymns, and we would sing some of the old ones and some of the more modern ones, like "I'll Fly Away."
Yeah. Wow. And I've never been in your shoes, but can imagine the significance of that. And
that time will come for you, Luke. It comes for everybody. Yeah,
it's true.
Part of living on this planet is that there comes a time when we pass into an existence that we have some clues about, but we don't really have any personal testimonies of people coming back and saying, this is what it's like. So there's an active faith there, and definitely a feeling of transition. I've not had a visitation after death, certainly not from my mother, but about 50% of people, Christian and non-Christian, claim that they have either a startling vision or a strong dream. My wife had one after her mother died. C.S. Lewis had one.
Wow.
There 50% of people who are who lose a person close to them do experience that. And it's just a little rumor of what may await.
Would that be maybe you can speak to your wife's experience if she's open to that, but just when you say a visitation, is that just some sort of clarity or sense of what the person that you've lost has entered into? Is that what you mean by that?
Actually, it's not. The ones I have heard, and in my wife's experience, it's a way of saying, I'm okay. rest easily. Don't worry about me. I'm okay.
Wow.
And that's really all you get. They don't describe, here's what it's like. And, of course, the biblical descriptions have a lot of meaning for people who lived in palaces with gold streets and things like that, but not a lot of meaning for us. It's not a modern context. And that's normal all the way through the Bible. The prophets, people speak to the circumstances in which the readers are, not to what we're going to be thousands of years later. But it's a comfort saying it's okay. You don't need to worry about me anymore. I'm in good hands.
Yeah. Wow. Well, in light of that, I wonder, Philip, could you speak to those who are maybe listening in who like you can relate to a recent loss, losing someone they love, and they're feeling that grief, but maybe haven't had that sense of like it's okay, or would do anything for that sort of experience that you described your wife and others having? Would there be a word of maybe comfort or wisdom or encouragement you would give to those who are in a season where they're going through, the first Christmas without a spouse or a parent or a child, or, everything is a new normal, as they say, but it's a normal marked by loss?
Yeah. I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is don't practice this alone. Sometimes you see in the advertisement, don't attempt this alone. These are professionals. And grief shouldn't be endured alone. It's a time when we are vulnerable. It's a time where our mind goes all sorts of different directions, and we need the wisdom of others around us who give us a different perspective. And in some cases, it may be a professional like you, Luke, on a pastoral staff where you have had some experience. Anybody involved in hospice, from the very beginning, the modern hospice movement was started by a woman who believed the spiritual component was essential. So the early hospices always have a chaplain, and many of them still do. They're trained. They've seen many deaths. It's scary for those of us who have not. It's a strange experience, but don't practice it alone. And if you have close friends or some people in your family, I know often it brings out the rifts, the divisions in a family. But if you have someone who you feel like is on your side, to be with those persons and express the feelings and actually go through the feelings together with someone that you trust.
Wow. So significant. Thank you for sharing that, because for so many people that can be a very isolating journey, but it doesn't have to be, especially if you're connected to a faith community.
Right.
Speaking of faith communities, I know we touched on this. We're talking about this before we started the recording, and it's a bit of a pivot from what we've spent the last few minutes talking through. But Philip, from our interactions, one of the things I've really benefited from in you sharing your testimony, your writings, and other things, is your ability to walk through your own experience of unlearning and relearning, if you will. And I know that you've written most recently in your memoir, but also before then, about having to really step back from and kind of take apart the worldview that the church you grew up in gave you, of society, of race, of what the gospel looks like, and more. And my guess is, feel free to correct me, but if you were in that process today, someone would say, "Oh, Philip, you're deconstructing."
Right.
I don't want to force you into a label or anything, but I wanted to probe kind of in that to say, given the fact that so many people are at this place of saying, wait a minute, I don't know if that's right. I don't know if what my church really insisted on, or maybe my family or other faith figures of authority said to me, is if that's really sound. I need to re-examine this. I wonder, given your own personal experience of that unlearning, that re-examination, that, if it's fair to say, deconstruction followed by reconstruction, what would you say might be some of the ways that process, whether you call it deconstruction or disentangling or unlearning, can actually serve a redemptive role in a person's life?
Yeah. By the way, Did you notice, Luke, that I brought my Commonwealth mug to the
I did. I was
today?
going to comment on it earlier. I was going to say, are you a fan of the royal family or?
Deconstruction. Yes, we didn't know that word when I was growing up, but I emerged from a church very confused and suspicious. In fact, you talk about redemption. The suspicion, I think, is what propelled my career, because one by one, I picked up the essentials of faith and looked at them saying, can I really believe this? What is Jesus really like? Does prayer really work? You know, those kinds of questions. These are my books. And it comes from a childhood church experience. I mentioned the circumstance when I was just a year old, when the church thought they had a strong word from the Lord that my father would be healed, and he wasn't. So that was a fatal error that they made. It was a theological error. They assumed that they knew something, some secret from God that turned out not to be true. And my church gave me several opportunities along that line. You mentioned the race. I was growing up in Atlanta just as the civil rights movement was starting. Martin Luther King was our most famous citizen in Atlanta, and yet from our church he was vilified from the pulpit. They called him Martin Lucifer Coon, which was just an opprobrium that they applied to him, slang. And then as I told in my memoir, I realized that the church lied to me about those kinds of things. They were telling me things that were clearly not true about race. And then I started wondering, well, if they lied about race, maybe they lied about Jesus, maybe they lied about the Bible, and suspended my faith for a time. And in a sense, my whole practice of writing is my way of reconstructing, reconstructing faith, because I do take little parts of what I was taught, examine them, kind of circle cautiously around them, and go to the Bible, and go to people. I guess I would give two words of advice, kind of opposite words of advice. One is, I watched in my brother, who took a different tack. He also experienced the toxicity of that church, of that community. And his response was I'll show them, I'll do the opposite of everything they taught me. So if there was a rule book about the things you shouldn't do, he made sure he did all of them, all the sins. And of course, when you do that, these are self-destructive choices. So he became addicted to drugs and to alcohol and to sex and to anything that you can get addicted to. And he was the one who paid the price for that. Yeah, he rebelled. He proved you can't make me go to church. You can't make me believe in God. And that's true. And not even God does that. He gives us freedom, but he also shows us this is the best, freest way for you to live.
Right.
I came to set you free, Jesus said. I came to give you abundant life. And my brother proved, sadly, really bore the impact of making those choices. So that was one direction. Be very careful that you don't just destruct. There's deconstruction, but there's also destruction, and my brother took that destruction path. And the other more positive outlet, which is one that by God's grace I experienced, and that is, I found people I wanted to be like. I was a journalist, and when I started, this was in the days of Watergate with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein.
Wow.
And I thought, man, wouldn't that be great to be an investigative reporter, especially in the Christian world, where I could take apart these people and make them look like jerks, and people who were wearing the cloak of Christianity but were an embarrassment, either prosperity gospel or various things. And I did some articles early on about those people, and I didn't really enjoy them because you do have to spend so much time with jerks, And I thought, I'm learning what I don't want to be like. I think maybe I should concentrate on who I want to be like. And then it was about that time that I came in contact with Dr. Paul Brand, who it became my surrogate father, really. He was in his 60s, silver-haired British surgeon. I was in my 20s, wild-haired, post-hippie, in America, but that odd coupled together on several books, 3 different books, over a period of 10 years. And that gave me a period to sort through my faith, to do that. It had already been deconstructed, but to gradually, piece by piece, reconstruct it. And I think that's a word of advice that I would give to people going through that confusing period. Find people you really want to be like, and see what makes them. David Brooks is a writer, Christian writer for the New York Times, and in one of his books, he says, learn the difference between resume virtues and eulogy virtues. Resume virtues those are the things that your culture is telling you all the time. What kind of car you drive, how big your house is, how many degrees you have on your resume, to impress people with your status and how well you're succeeding. And our culture honors those, almost worships them. But he says it's funny. The funny thing, when you go to funerals, you don't hear people say, Luke was so smart. He bought Microsoft stock at $2 a share, and it's now worth $100. They don't talk about that. They talk about he was a good man. He was a family person. He was loving. He helped. He volunteered for the poor. Those are the eulogy virtues. And I would say find people who have the kind of virtues that you would like to be known for, and then find out what that secret is. And in my case, as a journalist, because that was my job, find people and write articles about them. Again and again, the people who most took their direction in life from Jesus, those are the people I wanted to be like. And it was a reconstruction of my faith, kind of point by point. I knew all the concepts because I had grown up in that church saturated environment, but I hadn't seen it lived out very well. And I eventually did see it lived out very well. And I kept going to these people and then trying as a journalist to shine a light on them, to expose them to others. Because, anytime a celebrity type Christian makes a moral failure or something, that's big news. But you don't see the news so much for these people behind the scenes who are out there on the front lines of faith doing what Jesus told us to do. And as a journalist traveling around the world, I've had the opportunity to see that a lot.
And you saying that makes me think of a couple I knew growing up on the mission field, Trevor and Heather Smith from Australia, who some would say had more to do with the eradication of leprosy in Thailand than anyone else. He was a dermatologist. And I've often thought, why isn't somebody, talking about this man who, just worked in a humble clinic in the city I lived in. So that's so valuable to you, Philip, and just, to see what a life of purpose and self-giving love can really impact others.
And they take different forms. You mentioned leprosy. Of course, Dr. Brand was a leprosy specialist.
Right.
And more recently in our time, we went through this great crisis of HIV/AIDS. And there are 2 people who may have done more to turn the corner on that than anybody else, but they did it in different ways. One was Michael Gerson, who's a Christian, a graduate of Wheaton College. And when President George W. Bush was in office, to everyone's surprise, he started this PEPFAR program and committed like $10 billion to combat AIDS in Africa at a time when it's hard to raise money for anything. So that was in some ways an unlikely person to push that. And a lot of it was because of Michael Gerson, who said, we just have to do that for moral reasons. We're going to lose a whole continent. We're going to have 16 million AIDS orphans unless you do something. So that was a bureaucrat, a speechwriter for George W. Bush, who really believed and kept pressing. Michael died earlier this year.
Oh, no.
And people talked about that again and again at his funeral. This was his legacy. This was his eulogy. And then just recently, I did a column on another person who had a lot to do with that, and that's Bono.
But I was gonna say that's a
There
second
you
ago. I
go.
was gonna say, are you thinking of
Yeah,
Bono? Yeah,
I
say
am
more.
thinking of Bono.
Yeah.
And he could do anything he wanted, and he spent months on a bus, like a Greyhound bus, although a little nicer than the Greyhound, going from place to place to try to alert the Christian community, to awaken them about the AIDS crisis, and to get them behind whatever was necessary to stop this. So he went to Wheaton College and other Christian colleges, and went to the mega churches, Saddleback, and various places, and really turned the corner on galvanizing the Christian community to support, which helped the government programs as well. You get that evangelical community behind you, and that's a lot of votes. So two very different people, one kind of renegade superstar, and the other is the opposite, a White House bureaucrat. But we have different callings, and in this case, they both have the same goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And that book, maybe you've read it, Philip. Surrender, kind of the
A lot of it, yeah.
autobiography. By Bono.
I saw his tour. Yeah, it's an amazing piece of work. Yeah,
very valuable. Well, Philip, thank you for sharing that. And I find myself, as you were sharing a few moments ago, just about the really good advice of saying, who are the people following Jesus, and that you say, wow, like I want my life to imitate that, right, and to embrace doing life with them. I'd love to delve a little deeper into that, in terms of, I sense today, and maybe you could speak much better to your generation than I could, but when I interact with millennials, I'm a millennial, and also Gen Z, I do really sense a spiritual hunger, and I feel a lot of it is shaped by this desire to actually see the power of the gospel transform individual lives. And I know that you mentioned in Soul Survivor this great quote that kind of tackles head on the hypocrisy that people see in the church, and kind of yearns for that deep personal transformation. And so I want to read the quote and just invite you to speak to that tension that people see and feel, and what it looks like to encounter the gospel on a level that's personally transformative. So here's the quote from your work, Soul Survivor. You say, "As I think about individual Christians I know, I see some people made incomparably better by their faith, and some made measurably worse. For every gracious, kind-spirited, forgiving Christian, I can point to a proud, mean-spirited, judgmental one. In my own experience, those who strive the hardest and believe the most fervently are sometimes the least attractive persons. Like the Pharisees of Jesus's day, they get caught up in competition and end up self-righteous rather than righteous. Politicians tell me that their nastiest letters come from people who quote the Bible and claim to speak for God, which I easily believe since my mailbox shows the same pattern. How do I resolve the tension between the ideals of the gospel and the actuality of those who profess it?" So I want to echo that question. As the quote states, how do we resolve this tension between the ideals of the gospel, a personal transformation that we can be filled with the power of the Holy Spirit and so much more, and the actuality of those who profess it?
Yeah, the detective story writer Dorothy Sayers, the British writer who wrote the Lord Peter Wimsey series, also she wrote some very good theology books. One called The Mind of the Maker, and in that she says that God underwent three humiliations. The first was the incarnation. The God of a trillion galaxies became a human being on one tiny little planet in one tiny little galaxy, one tiny little solar system. And what a humiliation that was. What an act of humility, as Philippians 2 tells us. And the second was the crucifixion, where coming to bring us salvation and coming to show us what God is like and what we should be like, for that he was murdered, he was executed. And then she says the third humiliation, which may be the worst of all, was the church. and that's God giving God's own reputation to the likes of us. So Jesus spent his time here, and then he left, and he said, "It's up to you guys. Bye," and ascended, took off,
Yeah.
and said, "It's up to you." And as the quote you read, we can all fill in the blank with individual people who demonstrate those characteristics on either side. The fact that God would entrust God's own reputation with us, what a gamble that was. And sometimes that gamble loses. The church may be as likely to turn people away from God as to turn them toward God. But God was willing to take that risk because he chose us. God had nothing to prove to the universe, but he did want to prove that even in a planet that has been stained, spoiled in certain ways, that God's Spirit can redemptively change human beings so that they don't act just survival of the fittest, look out for me, but they can act like Jesus acts. And what is the cure if you're in one of those churches? Well, the first thing I'd say is get your image of how you should be from Jesus, not from the people around you. And then look for those people who are most like Jesus. You'll find some who have characteristics and traits that live out the principles that Jesus came to give us. But don't ground yourself in I'm going to trust my pastor. I want to be like my pastor. No, you want to be like Jesus, and spend your time trying to figure out what that looks like. I wrote a whole book about that, Jesus I Never Knew, trying to sort through the messages that I got in childhood Sunday school with Jesus that I now believe, and the image of Jesus that I have, and that to me the Bible portrays. So I guess that would be my starting point.
Yeah. It's almost like you're creating a mosaic in some ways of drawing from strengths in different men and women's lives to say, right. Oh, I see the character of Christ in you in this, and I want to embody that en route to, being like Jesus. Well, Philip, a lot of conversation in this time in history, which isn't just unique to this day and age, but just has to do with journeying through culture, how the church shows up in culture, the right or wrong presence and influence the church should have in culture. And you grew up in an incredibly tumultuous time culturally. I think it's safe to say, when you think of living through the cultural chaos of the 60s, presidential assassination, the assassination of people like Malcolm X and obviously Martin Luther King, and then the kind of roller coaster of the 70s, which was marked by a real turning away from historic moral values or traditional mores. And so when you think back to those eras and living through those and learning from those and considering the hostility and the polarization that can exist in culture today, what do you find yourself saying, no, this is what our culture needs. This is the presence the people of God need to seek to have in communities and in nations today?
That's a big one. And I've been thinking about that a lot, Luke, because this year is the 25th anniversary of one of my books, What's So Amazing About Grace. And so I put myself back in that time. It was published in the very end of the 20th century, so I think 1998. And things were looking pretty good. The Cold War was over. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Russia and the West were cooperating on so many things. And a lot of Eastern European countries were experiencing democracy for the first time in years. South Africa had a changeover of government that went relatively peacefully. And it was the biggest news in the United States was Bill Clinton, his relationship with the White House intern. I mean, that was front page news every day. You compare that to now, where you've got the Donald Trump phenomenon, which is on the front page every day. You got the Ukraine war, which is on the front page every day. And just an increasing hostility, rumors of religious persecution in India and China rearming. It's a much more dangerous place than it was 25 years ago. And my country, the United States, is much more divided. Bill Clinton got people from both sides of the aisle to support a lot of his programs, welfare reform and crime bill, balanced budget, 4 years in a row, a balanced budget, just astonishing in view of the debts that we pile up every year now. And so I'm not going to say this is the most divided the country has ever been. I lived in the 1960s when there were bombings almost every day, 1,000 bombings a year of protest, and a great division between the generations, the young generation and the older generation. But it's pretty divided. It's certainly divided politically. And of course, the danger there is that a lot of Christians are putting their energy into that political division, and they look through that political lens. And it's a long book, but I would recommend people to go back to Augustine, the City of God and the City of Man. He wrote about that back in the Roman Empire. If you put your energy into the city of man, it's going to be a divided place. If you put all of your hope in politics is an adversary sport. Politics, you win by making fun of your opponent and just fighting them. Martin Luther King used to say, there are some wars we have to fight. We use different weapons, the weapons of grace, the weapons of love. And he spelled that out. And I don't see people doing that. There's a cultural divide, and for many people, politics has become the new religion. And it's not a healthy thing. And what do? Well, I pray for leaders who can truly represent a moral difference, people with integrity, people who have the guts to say, my party affiliation, they tend to think this side of an issue, but for me, because it's not just my party that I'm responsible to, it's my voters and it's God. I can't go along with that. And we need those kinds of people. And instead, at least in the United States, it's very partisan. You have to go completely red or completely blue. There's nothing purple in between.
Yeah, I was going to say. Well, and so just on that, just to probe that a tiny bit, that's so right. I agree with you in gracious leaders. But just on the individual level, those people who may never have a significant level of communal or national influence on a day-to-day basis, how do we embody grace in a world that's much more familiar with that strife and polarization, and you could even say unforgiveness, than a robust understanding of grace?
Fortunately, there are some people who are recognizing the problem and talk about and write about. Like, we have these TED Talks in the U.S., and I've heard some wonderful presentations where people talk about, or there's an organization called Better Angels, and they get people together who have dramatically different views on cultural wars issues and political issues. Equal number of strong Republicans, equal number of strong Democrats. And they have to have a very civil conversation. You can't speak directly to your opponent. You have to go through Madam Chairwoman, and kind of the old-fashioned civil way of discussing differences. And a lot of it has to do with listening. I learned as a journalist, if you go into a situation where you have very different views than the person you're writing about, it doesn't help to say, boy, you sure are wrong about that, because immediately walls go up. You don't get the real person. And my job as a journalist is to bring out what this person thinks and why they think that way. That's my job, whether I agree with it or not. And so I learned that maybe the most important thing we can do is listen compassionately. So that my goal is to find out, let me see if I can somehow repeat what you said in a way that might make sense to my readers. Not let me show you why you're wrong in what you said. And I think if we started by doing that, that respects the person we're with. I go back to Jesus, and so few times did he give a direct answer to a question. He would often throw the question back to the person. He's engaging. He's pulling them out. He's not just saying, "You are wrong. Here's what you should do." Rarely did he do that.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I think it's only 3 times in all 4 gospels.
Yeah,
Jesus
right.
Straight up answers a question. You're right.
Yeah, Brendan Manning says that. I've never gone through and quoted, but he says about 180 times people asked him a direct question. Only 3 times did he give them a direct, simple answer.
Yeah. Well, but if I'm hearing you right, Philip, yeah, compassionate listening is such a powerful agent of grace. And I wonder, you alluded to this a moment ago, that 25 years ago you wrote What's So Amazing About Grace, and I'm excited for this. It's coming out again in the fall of 2023, the revised and updated edition of What's So Amazing About Grace. But I know that many people will say, yeah, well, Philip, if my neighbor's kind of rude to me, I feel like I can listen compassionately, and okay, like he and his wife are not doing well, or work's been stressful, and I feel like I can wade into that space and see how gracious conduct has redemptive implications. But Philip, like, look at history. Look at the Rwandan genocide. Look at more recently the unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine. Can grace actually withstand the brutality of that kind of animosity and hate? And can it actually make a decisive, redemptive difference?
Yes. Look at South Africa, where at the time there were 20 million Black Africans and 5 million whites. And the 5 million owned all the guns and most of the money, most of the wealth. And then there was a changeover kind of imposed on them. And suddenly the 20 million Black Africans were going to have the guns and the power, the political power. And everybody expected a bloodbath. But it was the moral leadership of people like Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, who said, we're not going to go that way. Mandela, after spending 27 years in prison, made sure that his jailer was on the platform at his inauguration. Imagine what that symbolized to the country.
Yeah.
He said, we don't have time for justice. Man, we don't have time. There's got to be another way. And he chose that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which had its own, it wasn't just, these things don't matter. Yeah, they matter. They came out in gory detail, the terrible atrocities that were done. And yet there was a different path, a path of restoration, a path of restorative punishment and forgiveness even. So there's an example there. Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, when the country was actually breaking into two, the example he gave. And there are other examples, but we happen to be living, as you say, in one of those moments of history when the divisions and the hostility are just right in our face every day, and it's easy to lose sight of certain facts. Well, look at who are our greatest allies in North America. They're countries like Germany and Japan. These were our enemies, These fought like crazy in World War II. So how did that happen? Well, because of the Marshall Plan, where at the end of the war, we didn't say, we're going to make you pay. We're going to, they tried that in World War I. It didn't work, produced Nazi Germany. But it was a different way, the way of grace, kind of on an international scale.
Thank you. Those are poignant and powerful examples. And for the person listening in that says, Philip, you've sold me on the reality of grace. I know you've described grace as God's love for the undeserving. And how does someone embrace that? How does someone receive the reality of that grace?
Yeah, well, as Henry Nouwen used to say, good Canadian, toward the end of his life, Grace is absolutely free. There's nothing you can do to earn it, nothing you can do by definition to deserve it. It only goes to the undeserving. And it's a free gift, but to receive a gift, you have to have your hands open. And so many people, like in Jesus' day, the Pharisees, the most religious, the most righteous, Bible-believing people, they had their hands tightly like a fist. And I don't need your help. I'm better than that publican over there, that sinner over there. And so grace would fall to the ground unreceived. And Jesus said, if you just have your hands open, like that publican, that sinner, that prostitute, then grace is there for you. And that's our job as Christians, to not get smug and start thinking we're holier than thou. My goodness, we're not. Compared to God, we're all pretty miserable. And yet we have that message of forgiveness and transformation that we can offer the world. And following Jesus, we would go to what society views as the least deserving people, because they're the ones who very often have their hands most open. They know their lives are a miserable wretch, failure.
Well, in a really significant way, Philip, you'll be partnering later this fall with an organization, Affect Hope, that is wanting to live from that posture of saying we've received incredible grace, and we want to be a part of administering that grace, if you will, to those around the world with tremendous need. And I know that later this September, you'll actually be in the Greater Toronto area to speak in partnership with Affect Hope about their global efforts to eliminate leprosy. And I know from your international travels that you've had multiple interactions with men and women who've endured not only a very impoverished reality of life, but severe diseases and all kinds of health challenges. And so I wonder if you could speak to both the heart behind that speaking tour and your understanding of, given those experiences in your own life, of the heart of God for those who have that great need, and how you see God's people being invited to administer that same grace that they've received to others. Could you speak to that, Philip?
Yeah, leprosy is such a great example, because virtually all of the advances in the understanding and the treatment of the disease have come from Christian missionaries. Not because they were necessarily the best scientists, best doctors, but they were the only ones willing to go and risk their lives, as they thought at the time, to minister to leprosy patients. As it turns out, it's not very communicable disease. Most people are naturally immune to it, and it's not that easily spread. So a lot of the fear of the disease was ill-founded, and the the pictures that we have in our mind from Ben-Hur and movies like that of disfigured faces and missing limbs and things like that, those can all be prevented, because they're primarily and almost exclusively results of leprosy patients not feeling pain. So a lot has happened, and the reason that we can talk about eradicating leprosy is because of the work of Christian missionaries over centuries, who would in their minds risk their health, risk their lives by reaching out to the most despised and feared people on the planet. Yes, I'm looking forward to coming to Canada. We actually started this tour right as the pandemic began in Vancouver.
Oh, wow.
And the next stop was going to be the Toronto area. And then boom, we barely got back into our country, when they shut the gates between the two. So it's been 3 years coming. And it's good to be able to come back to Canada. This is going to be the very last week of September, 26th through 28th, around there. But I'm sure people can go. Maybe you can show a website or something. But Affect Hope used to be called the Canadian Leprosy Mission, and they have expanded to some other tropical diseases as well in their treatment and support of those who are out there. So I look forward to being in the Toronto area for a whole week. I'm going to catch a play at Niagara on the Lake while I'm there.
Right
which I've
on.
never, yeah, which I've not done before. And maybe some of your leaves will be turning colors by then, and it should be a glorious time. Very end of September.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, you'll have to have your fill of Canadian maple syrup while you're up here. But yes,
Absolutely.
Philip will include specifics on those dates in our intro
Great.
to this conversation, so that people listening can dial in. But also, they can Google Affect Hope and your name, Philip Yancey, and those dates will come up as well. So, speaking of Googling, though, where could people learn more about you, Philip, or connect with you online, or specifically as we anticipate the release of the revised and updated edition of What's So Amazing About Grace? Where could they pick up a copy of that?
Right. And I should say that the publisher has promised us that new edition will be available in Canada even before it's officially released in October.
There you go.
So
VIP
you guys are
pre-release status.
first. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I do have a website with a regular blog called just philipyancey.com.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I'm an old man. I use Facebook. I don't use Instagram or TikTok or any of this modern nonsense. So I have a Facebook site, again, under my name. And I think somebody posts some things now and then on Instagram that I've never even looked at it. So, and I don't Twitter, but I try to be as old fashioned as possible. I actually read books and not spend all my time typing on a keyboard.
Brilliant. Well, yeah. Well, that's for those, again, who are dialing in. Those are great ways to connect with Philip. And also, I should qualify, it's October 3rd that the revised and updated edition of What's So Amazing About Grace comes out. But the week before, when Philip's in Canada, you can pick up an advanced copy. That's why I was excited a minute ago. So Canada first for the first time in a long time. It's something. And I'm glad it's this release. Well, Philip, you've been super gracious with your time. Really glad that this is now the second time you've joined us on the podcast, and hopefully we'll be able to do it again in the future. But thanks for everything you've contributed, and we're looking forward to having you in Canada in September.
Great. See you there, Luke.